Okay, so welcome to the Warburg Institute Directors Seminar. I am the director, Bill Sherman, and it's a real pleasure and honor to have Kristina Richardson here from University of Virginia. We've been trying to get Kristina scheduled in for a talk for months and months, it feels like, and we're so happy that the time has finally come around. Bit sorry that it's still on Zoom and not in person, but I have a feeling we'll have other opportunities down the line to get her here with us in person. But this is a great area of research that we've been very, very eager to share. And Kristina's work is really changing the way we look at all kinds of things, as you'll see. We've had a practice in our internal weekly seminars, the so-called work in progress seminars, where people can nominate other speakers. And when they do, the reward is not only getting to hear the speaker, but then having to introduce them. So in this case, our nominator of Kristina was our own PhD student, Beatrice Bottomley, and we're very happy that Bee's come back, having just finished the PhD, to give us a quick introduction to Kristina and her work. And then we will hand over to Kristina herself. But thanks, Kristina, and thanks, Bee, for getting Kristina here and saying some words about her. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bill. And thank you so much, Kristina, for really generously agreeing to do this talk. I actually first met Kristina Richardson at a summer school on Arabic manuscripts, and her seminar really brought to life for me all of the techniques that we've been studying by showing how manuscripts and textual objects can bear witness to actors that are often marginalized within histories of the pre-modern Islamic world and beyond. And Kristina's research focuses on the writings and material productions of non-elites in the pre-modern Islamic world. She has, for example, analyzed the intellectual networks of medieval disabled writers, explored the degraded position of blue and green-eyed people in the early Islamic world, and also identified the only known pre-modern Arabic sign alphabet. She's the author of 2 books, Difference and Disability in the Medieval Islamic World, Blighted Bodies, which was published in 2012, and Roma in the Medieval Islamic World, Literacy, Culture, and Migration, which came out in 2022. And this latest book, which really brings to light the kind of cultural contributions of medieval minority communities, was awarded the Dan David Prize in 2022, in addition to the Monica H. Green Prize for Distinguished Medieval Research in 2023. And it also received an honorable mention in the Middle East Medievalist 2023 Book Prize. In 2021, Kristina also co-published with Boris Leibniz a study and edition of the earliest known Arabic notebook of an artisan or merchant. And she's currently working on her 3rd book, Black Basra, Race, Slavery, and Science in Early Islamic History, which offers a history of the port of the city of Basra from the 7th to the 11th century, but really centers the lives and experiences of free and unfree Black people. As Bill just said, Kristina is currently the John L. Now Professor of History and Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia, and she's also the co-editor of Dar Islam Journal. There is so many other things I could say, but I'm just going to stop here because I think I'd rather leave the space to Kristina to speak. But yeah, just thank you so much, Kristina. I'll pass it over to you.
Amazing, thanks.
Thank you so much that's really a generous introduction. Thank you so much. And also for facilitating this invitation. Thank you as well to John Millington and to Bill Sherman for all of your support as we've been making this event possible. So as Bee has said, my work has moved gradually, has moved gradually from people with less and less political power and social visibility. So the work I'm doing that I will show you today on the Romani printers, I'm actually going to share my screen now just to get this started. And just a minute. Okay.
Great.
Okay, super. So what I want to show is just basically I guess I'll start off with a thesis. I know that's maybe not the way to start off a talk, but I just want you to know where we're leading. So what I will argue today is that Gutenberg, who we all know invented the printing press in the 1450s, in the mid 1450s, may have been preceded by Romani travelers coming into Central Europe in the 1410s. And I just want to basically discuss a print history, a more integrated print history that brings in block printing before letterpress printing, and that brings in Asian and North African contributions before German ones. And just to see how it's basically a less tedious story than, say, one man who was inspired, and out of nothing created this amazing invention, and just to speak about how more integrated histories across continents, across religious spaces, linguistic spaces, are actually just make for more interesting and compelling histories, I think. So what I'll start off with is just doing a brief overview of Asian print histories. I mean, very brief. So what I'm showing here is the Diamond Sutra, which is in the British Library. And this is the earliest printed book in the world, printed in the year 868. The colophon tells us the date. This is not the oldest Chinese block print, however. That would actually belong to an early 8th century, Buddhist sutra. It's a miniature charm scroll made of mulberry paper. It's printed with 12 blocks, and it was discovered in a pagoda, actually in a Korean temple. So this is a very old technology of, we get a better sense of it perhaps here, of multiple blocks being used to print a long scroll. So inked blocks pressed onto paper or parchment, as we'll see. But that is probably a much better known history than the one I'm going to talk about right now, which is a Middle Eastern history of printing. So we do know that, and what you have in front of you here is it's thought to be an 11th century. There is no date written on this text, and does not have a colophon. You can see that it's a fragment, if you can see this entire piece here. And just I'm zooming in here so that you can see that it's composed of multiple languages. And we'll talk about printing actually in Middle Eastern spaces. So this is actually in Arabic in the central frame, and it's the story of the 7 sleepers. And what you have in the margins of this particular block print is text in Hebrew or Hebrew script. Down here you have text in Syriac and Aramaic scripts. And you also have Greek. I didn't zoom in here, but up here you have actually Greek script. So this is a quadrilingual block print from the Middle Ages. It is thought that the actual movement of block printing technology from East Asia through Central Asia and into West Asia, or what we call today the Middle East, was probably facilitated by Buddhists. Buddhists, again, were the earliest printers in East Asia. And it is thought that a particular family, actually they're called the Barma kids, and they were serving in the administration of 9th century Baghdad in roles as counselors and advisors. And it's probable that through their connections, there might've been this introduction of print. So this is a well-known phenomenon. However, it has been minimized in histories of the Middle East, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But what I will argue going forward is that certainly it was Buddhists bringing print and also paper technology into West Asia or the Middle East, but it was adopted mostly by a minority group who referred to themselves as the strangers. We would refer to them probably today more along the lines of traveling people. And it was the astrologers among them who actually were producing these prints. But I just want to show you a few more examples of representative prints. And this is not the earliest one that is known, this 11th century one. For instance, this is a print that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's a 10th century print. This is, of course, the full scroll, but I wanted to zoom in on some elements of it for you. What you can see is that it's entirely in Arabic. This is actually a portion of a surah from the Quran. So it's a religious text, much like the early Chinese text I was showing you. You also can see that or perhaps divine, this is very, very tiny script. It's a microscript. If you know Arabic, you can see that there are no vowels. It's just, the consonants are written in. So they're presuming a certain level of literacy for whomever is purchasing or using this scroll. But you can also see that there are decorative elements, right? That it's not just purely script, that there's also, right, this vegetal motif here, and also geometric motifs. This is coming from, I haven't been able to see these in person. These are actually housed in Cairo. What's interesting about these early prints is that some have actual, figural representations on them. It was thought by the writer of this catalog that this might represent a demon or a devil. You can see the wings and perhaps horns here. But you can also see these octagonal, I know it's cut off, this is a fragment, but you can see the mirror of those sides. So this octagonal shape. And again, you have just a lot of script and, text in margins. You have in some instances white script, as you see here, on a black background, or black script on a white background. I just want to give you a sense of the variety of the types of scrolls that were in existence. And they also seem to mirror manuscripts that already existed in this period. So these are Quranic scrolls on display in Istanbul. And you can see that these are narrow, long, and they also have Quranic texts. So very much mimicking what we've seen, right, in these earlier variations. So the print product is mimicking the manuscript product, which is important to keep in mind. And just another way in which you can see the mimicry, again, this is a scroll from the Istanbul Museum of Art. And this is a print from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But you can see that there's a chapter heading here, and then there's text. And this format is mirrored again in print. You have a chapter heading, and then you have text. And again, it begins up here and goes down. So the visual culture is not coming out of nowhere. It's actually very contextual, very situated in a local pre-modern, or early Islamic, social context. And just to give you a sense of some of the dates of some of the printing that we can see, and I'm just showing you block printed texts. You can see the texts that I've shown you are Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and Greek script, probably Coptic Greek, and not German, of course, that comes much later. But you can see that the dates, at least for Arabic, start in the 10th century. We have samples of Syriac and Coptic that are coming in the 1100s, and same with Hebrew. So we have an Arabic art form that's expanding into local Middle Eastern languages, and of course predating German block printing by centuries. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. Movable type, however, is of course does not appear to have come up in the prints that I've been showing you. I've looked for evidence of movable type, meaning, errors in the printing, maybe if there's a letter or a couple of letters that are upside down or sideways, but I've not been able to find errors like that show movable type. So what we do know is coming from the 15th centuries and later. And just the last example of these pre-modern Middle Eastern prints. Here's one from 11th century Egypt. And this is also a coin from the same period in Egypt, in Cairo, as you can see here. And these concentric circles of text, kind of playing off of each other. So it's also possible to date some of these by some of the geometric uses and artistic and visual idioms that are used. So I would consider this actually a pretty rich discovery. I did not make this discovery. These have been, exhibited and printed. But as wonderful as I actually find these, I've actually been very surprised to read in a number of recent books and articles by Arabists and Islamicists that even though they are aware of these Middle Eastern print histories, have minimized their import. So for instance, in a recent book that was published on the rise of the Arabic book, and I want to highlight that these are texts these are statements that are made at the beginning of these books, right? So framing these later studies, talking about movable type in the internet, saying that these are products of the West. And then, however, in parentheses, there's a parenthetical statement, though movable type emerged independently in several places across the globe. So if you break down that sentence, that movable type is a product of the West, and then movable type emerged elsewhere, you can see that they're contradictory statements. The reason for that, I don't know, but I think it is a very consistent effort to to minimize just the originality of some of these Asian inventions. And secondly, I'm pulling a quote from Paper Before Print. This is a classic in the field of Islamic history. And he does acknowledge, this author, he acknowledges that Muslims knew about printing as early as the 10th or 11th century, as I've shown you. And he admits that they occasionally used it to make inexpensive amulets or to decorate cotton cloth. But he does not really accord this any sort of importance. Moving on to the book printing, basically the letterpress or movable type printing that emerges, as I showed you later, much later than block printing. But even in this brief sentence, you can see some of the biases, which are that one, that because these amulets, these long scrolls I've shown you are inexpensive, they're commodities, they're not really technology, they're not artwork. And then secondly, also printing only begins with movable type, right? And there's an effort here to really divorce block printing from later letterpress printing. I'm not sure that that's a division that's, well, ethically or even experientially necessary. So I think we can start to break that down a little bit. I would like to say that the assumptions I like to bring when I come into any sort of historical project is that an assumption, this is a quote from actually a colleague, Laurent Dubois, who's written about Haitian intellectual history in the early modern period. But he writes that we should begin from the assumption that there was an intellectual life within enslaved communities, and that this life involved movement between ideas and action, between the abstract and the particular, between past, present, and future. Even though, of course, he is speaking about a different time and place, I do think that if we can assume that there was an intellectual life behind the production of these block prints, that maybe we'll come to some very different understandings of this pre-modern history. So working from that assumption, let's continue. So I'd like to broaden the category of basically the Roma, gypsies, and travelers. When we use those terms in modern day, just in modern parlance, we're usually referring to what we think of as a very, a narrow ethnic group that subscribes to particular languages. And they're usually portrayed as people who live outside of majority society, meaning not adopting basically the mores and the mores of majority society. And in this map here, it's not one I developed, but this is just one, similar ones are floating, winning their way across the internet. It speaks of the Roma here as, originating in northern India and migrating over, very many centuries, but into Europe, as you can see. There's not much discussion about their existence in the Middle East, and Middle Eastern historians as well have not really spent a lot of time thinking about that. But what I would like to actually advocate today is that the narrowness of these definitions, and also this idea that they didn't integrate in any way with anyone around them, allows us to really silence some of these pre-modern, part of their pre-modern history. So a couple of things I was able to discover. This I can claim for myself. I was able to find that there was actually a term, as I've said, for these traveling peoples, and it encompassed all traveling peoples in the Middle East. So in Arabic, it's ghuraba, but I'll just keep using the English term strangers, but I'd like you to just be familiar with that word ghuraba. So they shared a particular lifestyle, meaning they did travel, meaning they did not prioritize possessions as a form of social advancement or just social status. And they also did not privilege an idea of a particular homeland or a physical space that they called their own. They communicated with each other. These were people of very many linguistic backgrounds, religious backgrounds as well. And they communicated in a lingua franca, which in Arabic was lughat al-ghuraba, which just means the language of the strangers. And that's what outsiders called this language. But speakers of this language actually called it seen. And I just have the word in Arabic. In Arabic script, I'm sorry, but it's pronounced seen. The thing about seen, well, first, before I get to seen, let me also say why I'd like you to keep in mind the word ghuraba. This will come up when we talk about Germany, but that even modern communities in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia still maintain this aversion, like some version of ghuraba in their in their self-naming. So I just have examples that you can look through, but especially if you work on the Middle East, or if you work on Central Asia and South Asia, you might be familiar with some of these groups, these Afghan, Syrian, Jordan, Palestinian, Tibetan, Egyptian, Sudanese groups that take this in their name. And the anthropologist Bernhard Streeck, in his book on traveling groups who lived along the Nile, he said that the most common denomination of gypsy groups on the Nile is ghuraba, which means stranger. So this is still today, you know, a name that is important. And the depth of the name, knowing that in the 13th century that groups began to call themselves this, is an important part of a history that I think we've overlooked. But why do I bring up the ghuraba? What does this have to do with printing? In their language, in Sin, or the language of the strangers, this is the only language in the Middle East that has printing terms. Of course, modern Arabic, modern Hebrew, and modern Greek, and modern Turkish, they all have printing terms now, but in the medieval period, they did not. So perhaps most spectacularly, there's not just a word for the block printed amulets that I've shown you, these scrolls, but there was also a verb to print, and there was you know, a noun for the book or the text that was produced. There was a scene term for the printing block, and there was a scene term for the person. Here I have the male version because I've only seen the male version. Presumably you could add an A and have the female version, torosha. I just hadn't seen it. And they also had their own terms for different sized amulets. There's a long story about how I was able to find those terms, but it wasn't as hard as it might seem. But we also have these terms being carried into the modern period. So it's a language, it's not a dialect, it's not a slang. Just like the term ghuraba, long lasting, the Sin language is still spoken today. And so in these manuscripts, for instance, that you can access in Cairo, Sirmalta, and another Sirmalta, these are works about basically art forms that were centered in these traveling communities. So I'm sorry. So, you know, play acting and entertainment and shadow plays such as these. So that's there. And another thing I'd like to say about in the Sin language, there's a lot actually of literary production. Here I just have one line from one poem. It's not entirely in Sin. It's actually it's a mixed poem, so it's mostly in Arabic with Sin vocabulary, but it's a very long poem. That's basically, it's an anthropological poem that explains a lot about their heritage. So what you see here is someone has written, so this presumably a gharib, a stranger, has written, how many times has my hand printed with a woodblock of tin in Syriac followed by Hebrew? Before the discovery of these texts in the Geniza archives in Cairo, maybe we didn't know how to actually understand this, but we do have Hebrew language block prints. So it's the literary culture is also explaining that one did not have to be a Christian who spoke Syriac or a Jewish person who spoke Hebrew to actually produce texts in these languages, right? You could be of any background and just be literate and be able to produce these works. Okay, so I hope that's been, and maybe we can do this more in Q&A, but I hope it's enough to show that there was Middle Eastern printing. It was, according to their own Sin sources, a technology that was co-opted by the ghuraba, strangers, and that it was not something practiced outside of the community. We also know that, so moving very quickly into Central Europe, we also know that Duke Michael was a man who identified himself as being from Little Egypt, and he arrived in Constance, which I just have in this map, which is just showing a pilgrimage route through Western Europe. But he arrived in Constance in 1417, and I'll come back to this map in a moment. And he approached, let's see, is this not gonna work? And he came to the Council of Constance, right, in 1417. It was a very long council meeting. King Sigismund, he approached, and we actually have a record from his meeting at the council. This is in German, of course, but what it does say is that on March 13th in 1417 in Constance, that there was Duke, like Herzog Michael from Egypt, and he was given a letter of protection. Now, we don't know exactly what this particular letter of protection said, but we do have a chronicle from Lübeck in the north of Germany that says that there had been people coming through, and he calls them a certain foreign and marvelous horde of people came from eastern parts, presumably Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, marching into Saxony. They called themselves Serani, and they had a king and a duke, like Duke Michael, and they had letters of recommendation from Sigismund, king of the Romans. So he doesn't name the leader of this band. So I'm not going to say that this is the same band. They might have split, we don't know. But what is important to keep in mind is that they named that the reason for this wandering and pilgrimage of theirs was said to be a rejection of their faith, and that they'd been commanded by bishops of the East to go on a pilgrimage for 7 years. So they'd converted from paganism, presumably Islam, to Christianity. And so because they had flip-flopped in their faith, they were walking in penance. I should say, this is a little bit later. This is from 1425 and was found in Spain. But this is also another person who names himself Count. He gives himself a royal title, and he also says he's from Lesser Egypt. From this term, Lesser Egypt is where we get the term gypsy. So lesser, so the C, the SY ending, showing a diminutive. So of little Egyptians is what I'll call them now. But this is an actual conduct letter. So presumably similarly to something that was produced for Duke Michael. What is interesting about Duke Michael's arrival in Constance is that right around the time of his arrival, we actually have the emergence of block printing in southern German monasteries. So again, this is Constance, and printing begins to emerge, emerges around Augsburg, Munich, and actually, as we follow this, this is called the Jakobsweg in German. So the, what is it? Anyway, so this pilgrimage route could take you very easily northward. If anyone has walked this Weg, and I actually did do that when I lived, not very far, but when I lived in Munich, I went with a friend and my daughter, and we tried to walk a bit of it. It takes you outside of major cities. I know it looks as though you're passing straight through Constance or Munich, but you're in the countryside. So you're not probably going to be indicated in chronicles, in urban chronicles such as this one, or at least details about your arrival. But we do know these are two of the earliest known prints on paper in Central Europe. They emerged in the 1410s, and they emerged and they were preserved in a monastery in Bad Reichenhall, which exists just, it's now a hotel, actually, this monastery, but the city's still there, of course, which is right outside of Munich, and it is right along the St. Jakobsweg. This is, again, not the only place where print emerged, but it's very interesting that if you follow the chronicles that mark, the arrival of different little Egyptian bands moving from southern Germany to the north, you can also match early prints moving upward. So why would that be? Well, I think it is important to realize or to remember, right, that Duke Michael and others have said that they're walking in penance, that they're pious. And this was a way to be on a road without, being accosted. And that possibly as they were walking along this road, that they were stopping into monasteries seeking food and shelter, and with the letter from King Sigismund, being able to acquire these necessities. And perhaps transferring a very old technology that has existed, as we've seen in the Middle East since the 10th century, and East Asia much earlier than that, bringing an old technology and not necessarily spectacular to Middle Easterners into central Germany. And similarly with all early prints, as we've seen, they have religious themes. This is Saint Dorothy and Saint Sebastian, very recognizable Catholic saints. Just as the Quran would have been a recognizable text, or the Hebrew Bible, or Buddhist sutras, right? So nothing obscure, but something that could open you up very easily to locals. And just to give a sense of a little bit more about maybe the 1400s and the early 1500s in Germany related to the Roma, we do have a notebook of a monk who lived in Grafing. I think on the next slide, I should have on this map. Here's Grafing, located outside of Munich. Again, early prints coming. Here's Bad Reichenhall, as I showed you earlier, in Grafing. So this gentleman from Grafing, he has a notebook in which he has here, as you can see, there are lines in which he has translations of various words. And he didn't just do this for Romani, which is listed here. He also did that for other, what we might consider obscure languages. I'm just going to show you a few of them. He did them for Czech, Polish, Russian, maybe Hebrew, Hungarian, etc. And he had the Latin equivalents. And he was using this, he writes in his notebook, to use these with proselytizing. So he would ask his informants, how do you say Jesus Christ or Mary or Mother in your own languages? What's interesting is with the Romani example, he doesn't have any Christian names or words. He does have a lot of astrological information, which might give you a sense of the types of, the interests of the people moving through. Admittedly, this is 1515, this is 100 years, even after the first little Egyptians move into Central Europe. But I think it gives you a sense of maybe who had access to the Roma, and it looks like maybe monastic communities for various reasons, maybe desires to proselytize and convert, but also maybe there was a mutual exchange because, again, food, shelter, etc. could have been had, or money perhaps could have been had from these monasteries. And another thing about the dialect that was actually recorded by Johannes van Grafing is that the words of, and this is from another article that I have cited here, Knauer's article, but some words of the Romani dialect in the Munich list seem to be linked to the Gurbet, if not the Bosnian Gurbet dialect of Romani. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So this a group that had also, kept not only the name of the Ghuraba in their personal name, but also in the name of their language and their linguistic dialect, probably shows, right, a very a linguistic and perhaps cultural connection to the Middle East. I just wanted, in maybe the last couple of minutes, is just to show you maybe some examples of Little Egyptians in 15th century European visual culture. I think that they're also immortalized in prints. This does not prove that there's a connection between the Roma and printing, but I also want to say there's an integration, there's a recognition of the Roma and their persons in these European cultures. So as much as they're written out of European history, seen as not European or not native Europeans, there was certainly a contribution, I think, made artistically and perhaps technologically. But just to say what the idiom was, for men, you can identify Little Egyptians through their striped garments, through women, their flat turbans. They have knotted cloaks at one shoulder, so a beautiful cloth. They're usually carrying babies. Their feet are bare, and all of them, but especially the children, are marked with pierced ears. I guess it's important that the children, to show that this was something done at birth, which was seen as pretty controversial in this local Catholic culture. So this print, as you can see here at right, is, you can find it online very easily, but it's at the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum in Braunschweig. And it depicts, as you can see, it looks like a tonsured man, but at least a balding man, and his female companion. Because they have a child, we're presuming that they are a couple. But what is interesting about her is that she has, looks like her entire household strapped across her body. On her head, she has a basket of chickens. She's got implements for weaving. They have animals, barnyard animals, and it imitates, I think you can pretty easily see, images of Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus. Sorry. So you can see more images like this, sorry. But as you can see, they're moving in opposite directions. That is important, sorry about that. That is important because if you've seen a TO map, and I seem to have lost mine here, but a medieval TO map in which it shows a circular world and there's a T in the middle. It looks here as though if you situate this picture on such a map, that I'm going to argue it's a Romani couple, that they're moving into Asia, that they're moving into Egypt. And again, going back to one of the chronicles that were written about these moving and traveling Roma, they said that they were in exile in sign or memory of the Lord's flight to Egypt. I'm sorry, so they're actually moving, excuse me, out of, these little Egyptians are moving out of Egypt into Europe. And so I think it's a pastiche of the Holy Family that's being brought here. The words at the top of her, at the top of this, it seems to be spoken by the woman, and it says, "My name is Busybody. My home is a mess." So anyway, it's a very obscure, it seems, caption, but it's also part of a growing recognition of just Roma people in local European spaces. And although that's a print, we also have many paintings and other forms of visual culture of Romani women in the crowd. You can probably spot at least two of them here. There's certainly this woman carrying a baby. Here's another one with a cloak tied at the shoulder. This is from 1435. And what you have these women and men representing in these various cases are often women who are of, dubious moral background in these particular stories, or just certain outsiders. So you can also see that these little Egyptians who are coming into Europe in the 1400s are also forcing a reimagination of these biblical stories about Egypt, right? What were these places like? Were there little Egyptians in the biblical period? And so you have putting them back into these histories in these other ways. I find this a very just interesting move in the 1400s. I just have a number of similar paintings, such as this one. Again, a turbaned woman coming to see the baby Jesus. You also have, and this is a very interesting one because it's up here, and I'll zoom in on this triptych, but of course you can see the Last Supper in the central frame. But if you look here, you can see again the tied cloak, you can see the turban, and you can also see a child with a pierced ear. Again, you wouldn't be able to see this unless you're very close to the image, of course, but that there's this recognition and maybe a transplanting of these little Egyptians into biblical stories. And it also matches with these chronicles that we have, right? And these report of little Egyptians, nearly all of them had their ears bored with 1 or 2 silver rings in each. The men were black, their hair curled, etc. And the women, their only clothes, a large old shaggy garment tied over the shoulders. In short, they were the poorest, most miserable creatures that have ever been seen. Okay, this is in Paris. This transplanting of Romani people into a biblical past is, of course, a fiction, but it's an attempt to make sense of a world that is around them. This is not my methodology in my history, but it does seem to mirror the methodology in which I'm trying to replace the strangers, again, who are migrating, or at least one band of strangers migrating into Europe in the 1400s back into history, and trying to imagine what that history might have looked like. I'll end on this note, which is that although we do not know that Gutenberg actually had interactions with the Roma or the little Egyptians in his lifetime, we do know that historians believe that Gutenberg was at the University of Erfurt in the same year, so in 1417, 1418, as the Roma were moving through. And there is a report from Erfurt of these little Egyptians coming through the city. So one can maybe imagine that he might have had some occasion to see a print, certainly an occasion to see a little Egyptian. And though we don't have definitive evidence of the Roma actually producing these texts and these prints and these images in southern Germany in the 1400s, we do know they had the means and they had the motivation. And I would actually call on historians of medieval Germany to continue this work, looking perhaps in monastic archives to see what kind of information, because this seems to be the group that had the closest interactions with the Roma, maybe what kind of information can come from there. I'm not trained as a Germanist, so this would have to be a collaborative effort, but I think it's worthwhile. I think it's an interesting place for historians to go to see just how minority groups might have contributed to some of the most impressive technological advances of our period. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Okay. That's great. Let me just remove the spotlight and then we can all gather collectively. Thank you very much, Kristina, for that overview of a very wide-ranging topic, lots and lots of different ramifications. And I just wonder before, just to remind everybody how this works. Hopefully you all remember that with Zoom, you can raise your hand with the reactions button. Bea has already shown the way. She has raised her hand. But the reactions button at the bottom will allow you to raise hand, and then that will allow me to ask you to unmute if you want. You can also, if you prefer, type a question or a comment into the chat, and I will be very happy to read it. Just as we start some Q&A here, I just wonder if we could give some thought to that very opening slide that you presented about how deep this received narrative about the importance of letterpress printing or movable type printing goes. I'm used to seeing it very much in kind of critiques of Eurocentrism from Asia, particularly from China, where, as you say, it goes way, way back. And I was very struck. I was at weirdly, a Rand Corporation conference about the parallels between printing and the internet. So it was very much about, this was about almost 30 years ago, and Elizabeth Eisenstein was the guest speaker, and it was very much about, you know, what are the parallels between our current communications revolution and the earlier one? And, you know, what can we learn from them, and what are the economic advantages, et cetera, the kind of thing you'd expect the Rand Corporation to be worried about. But it was so striking even then how it was all about Gutenberg. It was all taken for granted that everything starts in the 1450s with Gutenberg, despite the fact that there is, as you say, xylography and block printing for centuries before that. And I just wonder, have you had an opportunity in your early work now on this subject to think a little bit about where that comes from? Like, can you help us to place that blind spot or even suppression in some ways in its 20th century? I guess it's 20th century. Maybe it goes back farther.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's haunted me. I mean, I think we're incentivized to think of history as, and I think when I say we, I think professional historians. I mean, thinking of history as moved by one very brilliant, usually a man, and of course, you know, maybe with helpers. But I think this great man view of history is pretty dominant. And I think even with the best of intentions, it's hard to move beyond that. And it's also hard to, because it's also maybe for some a less compelling story than to say, you know, a bunch of people moving through the world might have very slowly over centuries brought printing into Europe. But I also think, yeah, there's a sense of upholding certainly European, but maybe more broadly Western modernity and citing it at this moment, right? So the arrival of the printing press is, for a lot of people, the beginning of early modernity. And so to integrate Asians, North Africans, perhaps Muslims, perhaps, you know, pagans, I don't know, but presenting, you know, that they had a part in early modernity of Europe. I think that's probably not a story that has a lot of currency. So yeah, I think there's a lot of,
Yeah, and I think the other part of it that has always struck me is how national it's not just about a great man, it's also about a nation. And when there are competing narratives, even in 16th, 17th centuries, that Elizabeth Eisenstein's work has gone on to uncover, it's very much about these competing national, you know, pride narratives, basically. And it's so interesting in this case with a people who are in general associated with not having a nation.
And in the medieval writings, they disavow the idea of a homeland.
Right.
Basically, they own, but the whole world, right? The whole world is theirs in a sense. So yes, I also think it's the way we incentivize historians to work. I mean, there are no prizes for Romani history or Romani, there's just there's no like series of an academic press devoted to the Roma. There, so I think, people who want to have jobs, they want to get a prize, and they're going to work on the national histories or women's history or gender, whatever is current. And I think that's the state of the world, but I think it does disincentivize us to think more in different ways about history.
Yeah. B, that's probably a good moment for you to come back in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristina. I really enjoyed seeing your talk, and also like how things have developed since the last time I kind of saw you speak about your work, and super exciting. And I think one of my questions was kind of basically what Bill just asked, so which is like, I mean, this whole kind of thing, the historiographical question of kind of how we frame narratives of technology, which is so prevalent within kind of the narrative of printing technology, but we see across the board in the history of science, and the way that we often prioritize things that appear to lead to the development of something that we perceive as modern technology, or as like foundational within European modern ideas of technology. So it's super interesting to see that. But then also as well how, like, making kind of more integrated approach to history, how through that we can kind of make space for contributions of non-elite actors, and also all of the difficulties around that. Also in terms of like the necessity of collaboration between people working across languages and disciplines. And I was wondering like how that, in some ways you also see that in the materials you showed at the very beginning, and I was wondering about the function of these like multilingual texts, like what was the context of their production? Do the Yoruba strangers talk about what their intention is, and what was the context of their use? And my second question was also, but I think you also answered that just at the very end, was just about if there is evidence of Roma produced prints within Europe, or so that was it really. But yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, those are great questions. So the material use of how these were used. So they were, as I said, produced by astrologers, and how they would have worked, say, on urban streets in the Middle East or North Africa would have been, and they write about this. So this is the thing. Actually, a lot of this has been translated because they wrote in Arabic and Seen. So the Arabic has been translated. Sorry, I'll pull up the translator's name. But anyhow, so they would have public performances, and they would read fortunes of people, and sometimes they would plant. They even say they would plant their own khuraba in the crowd, and so someone would say, "Oh my gosh, you guessed, you know everything about me," and so people would be impressed, and they would buy these charms. They would buy these amulets. So they were selling these products, and they say that they wanted to keep the technology secret. They write this in Arabic and Seen. So they wanted people to believe that this was handwritten, that these weren't just mass produced. I mean, just as, today, the impression of mass produced clothing, I mean, maybe we all wear it, but we probably wouldn't celebrate it. It's not something people wanted to know, would have loved. So yeah, a bespoke item is what they sold or purported to sell. And so I don't have prices. They don't talk about prices, unfortunately, but I presume that these were not very expensive, because there's one description of amulets piled high like pillows, and they were selling them. They just said for a couple of coins. I don't know which coins, but anyway, not a lot. So yeah, these were sale items. So why would they print in multiple languages? I think to appeal to Christians, Jews, Muslims. They don't seem to have any particular, other than astrology, which seems to be their own cosmological orientation. They weren't against Islam or Christianity or Judaism. If these were people who wanted to buy these things, they would print in their languages. So that seems to be it. It's not as lofty, perhaps, a story as we want to hear. It's commerce. It's naked commerce. Yeah.
Well, that's what Gutenberg came down to as well. So yeah, fair enough. I had a question in the chat that I will read to you, and it's basically, I suppose, about moving from movable type to movable printing. Because if the people are moving around is the printing technology itself portable? Do we know much about the presses being used for woodblock or block printing? And does that matter?
No, that is a great question. So the wood blocks, it's probably hard to have seen, but these were, small pieces of paper, and there were multiple blocks used to print along a scroll. So, I mean, you could hold a block in your hand. I mean, these weren't large, so you could carry them. And I think what is also important about the technology is that you only needed one person to be literate to make the block, of course. And then anyone could continue to print this. So in this sense, this was a brilliant technology for traveling people. And perhaps literacy rates were not, as high, of course, as they would be today. So, even in a low literacy environment, printing could have been effected pretty easily. So the portability was key, right? They weren't using large presses.
Interesting. And also, is there a sense of transferable technologies, as you kind of implied around the coin? Like sometimes when you see, let's say, a monogram stamped on a binding of a book, we know that that is a shared technology with stamping of like plate or, imprinting of various kinds can sometimes be shared across different kinds of technologies.
I think absolutely. And I know that Gutenberg, that he was actually, yeah, right. And when also fraternized with a number of coin makers. And
right.
So that was, so I think, there's probably a whole milieu around him that might have influenced his invention, maybe, early block prints, maybe goldsmiths. But in the Islamic world, we don't have much evidence of Khuraba working in mints, but we do actually have evidence, if you want to speak of movable type, with coins of people using, minters using punches just to get certain shapes in Arabic, and then using that to make words. I brought up that a little bit in my book, but I didn't go into it too much. But I think for numismatists and cultural historians, that would also be an important place to see where printing technologies were being reproduced. So I think the story just needs to be broadened a lot and investigated more.
So, I mean, I guess that's another good point. I don't see if anyone has other questions in the chat, ask me, or also do raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. But yeah, I mean, could you say a little more about, in the spirit of your closing comments, about, kind of what you're hoping other people will go on to help you find? A little bit more about where this might go, where your kind of hunches are, or when you have more time and more people helping, where do you want it to go?
Well, I've thought a lot about this actually, because it took me a long time to write this book. So I would like to see the material culture taken a little bit more seriously. I mean, I showed you a couple of quotes, and one that said basically, these were cheap, and they're basically, they didn't, in this book on printing in the Middle East, or in the world, there was no further discussion of that. And I think I'd also like astrology, because these were the astrologers making these texts, that I think thinking of astrologers as maybe, having an intellectual history and having intellectual lives, that, I mean, beyond, say, just observing the stars and astronomy, and that's very important, but also maybe how they might have contributed to intellectual life, and also how ordinary people might have had relationships with the sky that we don't have today. I mean, I don't know how much you look at the sky, what you think about it, but maybe how ordinary people might have actually, started to create theories of the world around their relationship with the sky. So this idea that the earth mirrors the heavens, heavens mirrors the earth, that how that might have structured thought. I know that's a bit off brand, but also I think there should be just a further investigation of the different types of people that the Khuraba might have circulated with. So the idea that they circulate, that the Roma alone knew no one else, seems not to be true. The Roma seem to have been part of the Khuraba, and there were other similar groups in this umbrella group. And maybe drawing out more what these collaborations and migrations together or separate might have looked like. And I think that undercurrent in Middle Eastern society certainly is just not understood, but also might help us understand why we think of traveling peoples as outside of civilization, right? I think there's this narrative around Irish travelers as being, I know this is very separate, but as being not Irish, although genetic studies seem to indicate that they are native to the Isles and that they split from sedentary Irish peoples at a particular point. I think it's the 9th century. So why we write out these groups for modern civilization is
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah, super interesting. There was a quick question online that I think is worth following up on, and it's a little bit related to what Bea was asking before, but the question of really whether there's any evidence of Romani printing kind of for an internal audience, for a Romani audience, or is it, very much a product to be sold externally?
That's a great question. In my book, I talked about Romani or Huraba, like literary culture in the Middle East, and it was they had oral assemblies that were a very fixed structure in which people would recite poems in scene, and there would be it's like a rap battle, right? Someone would recite something, someone else would respond. So that they write about in scene. They also produced books, painted and handwritten books about astrology, and they also produce these prints. Unfortunately, I haven't found prints that are in scene, or I haven't identified that. That would be a great find. I'd love to find that. But their literary culture is and it's beautiful work. I'll put a link in the chat to the manuscripts. And they're at Oxford, or one is at Oxford. So yeah, but they did have a very rich literary culture, I can say.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. And your observation, just in passing, that it was really perhaps the only language that early had a vocabulary around printing is really striking. I think that's a super important observation. Bea, any last questions from you? No, you're happy? Well, that seems to be it for now. And with the mention of the sports bar and the big screen TV, you've made me, it's dinner time here, so we're hungry. So thank you so much, Kristina, again, for sharing your work with us. And I definitely want to hear more as the project continues and this third book takes shape. So please come back and keep in touch. But yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the audience's attention.
Sure. Good. All right, everybody. Yep. Take care.